In this video, we're going to start talking about triangle congruence. So, triangle congruence is when we say that two triangles are congruent to each other. So, before we do that, there's a few things that you need to know. So, the first is that this symbol, this equal sign with this squiggly line over top of it, that means congruent. And remember, we said that congruent means equal. All right, so for practice problems 1 through 6, complete each statement. So it says, given that triangle JKM, which is our first triangle, is congruent to triangle PQR. All right, so in number 1 it says, angle M corresponds to angle what? So what you're going to do is you're going to say corresponds basically means is in the same spot. So you need to know that congruent means equal. And you need to know that corresponds means in the same spot. So in the same spot, but in different triangles. So one way that you can do that is you can look at the way that it's written. And so you can look at, if you're given something like this, where it says given triangle blah, 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 is congruent to triangle whatever, then you're going to say, what is in the same place as M? So if I'm looking here at the way it's written, in the same place as M is R. So that means that M and R are going to correspond to each other, which just means that they're in the same location. Now, if I don't have that information and I'm just looking at the triangle, I can say, okay, I know that R is going to correspond to M because it's almost like these triangles are mirror images of each other. So I can see that my M is kind of the point between the two endpoints, here and here. So it's the point in between the two vertices, and so my R is the same case. So my point in between the two vertices. All right, so P corresponds to what angle? So if I'm looking at P, P would correspond to J. And I can tell that P corresponds to J because P and J are in the top of the triangles. Q would correspond to K. So again, I'm looking at either the location on the triangle, or I can also look at the location in the way that it's written, if I have it written out. Now, that works for angles, but it also works for segments or sides. And so if I'm looking for, in number 4, JK is going to correspond to PQ. And I need to write it in the same order with the angles that correspond in the same order. All right, RQ is going to correspond to MK. And PR is going to correspond to JM. Now, I can either get that from looking at the angles that corresponded here. So in this one, I was saying, let's say with number 4. So JK corresponds to what? So J corresponded to P, so it needs to come first. And K corresponded to Q, so it needs to come second. So I can either do it that way. I can look on my picture, or I can look in the way that it's written. So if I'm looking like in number 5, I'm looking for RQ. So RQ is the last letter and the second letter just flipped. Then I can do MK because it's the last letter and the second letter, it's just flipped. All right, you try. Oh, actually, let's do this one together. So for practice problem 7 through 10, complete each statement. So you've got triangle GFH corresponds or is congruent to triangle JFH. So in number 7, it says triangle FGH is congruent to triangle what? So we want to put things in order of what they correspond to. So if I'm looking at this picture, I can tell that I've got one big triangle, but it's split into two triangles that appear to be congruent. So in this one, FGH is congruent to what triangle? We would say, okay, if we were to take this and we were to split it up into two pieces. So the first one being triangle FGH, and the second one being triangle FHJ. Alright, so when I'm looking at these two triangles, I can tell that they share a couple of points. So they're going to share F and they're going to share H. So whenever I go to write that triangle FGH is congruent to triangle what, I'm going to have to put the things that correspond in the same place. So obviously, F and H are going to be at the beginning at the end because I want to put things that correspond in the same location. Well, obviously F is going to correspond with F because these two pieces of these two separate triangles meet in the same place. So then I just have to say, well, what corresponds to G? So if I'm looking at this other triangle, J would correspond to G. So that means that triangle FGH is going to be congruent to triangle FJH. All right, so then we're going to move on to number 8, which says triangle HJF is congruent to what triangle? So again, putting it in the correct order, making sure that the angles that correspond are in the same location, then that means that I would say HGF. All right, triangle FHJ would be congruent to FHG. And the last one, GFH, or JFH, excuse me, would be congruent to GFH. Use the following figure to answer questions 11 through 15. So number 1, it says RS corresponds to what? So I think the easiest thing to do on pictures like this where you've got this one shape but you can obviously tell it's made up by two separate pieces is to separate it out. So if we separate it out, we would have the left side with the top being R, the side being T, and the bottom being S. And then I would have another triangle with the top being R, the side being V, and the bottom being S. So that way I can tell that this picture is two separate triangles. And that also kind of helps me out with these two, the top and the bottom, which are shared by both of the separate triangles. So when I'm looking at them separately, I want to know what RS corresponds to. So because they're separate, I can tell that RS is going to correspond to RS. Remember, corresponds means in the same place in the separate triangles. All right, TS would correspond to VS. And VR would correspond to TR. So is RTS congruent to RVS? Yes. All right. In the figure below, we're going to answer practice problems number 16 through 20. So what kind of angles are angles ACB and angles ECD? So this is information that you covered earlier in the week. So remember that when these two triangles are connected, the angles that are across from each other are what we call vertical angles. So angle ACB and angle ECD are going to be vertical angles. Now remember that vertical angles are a special type of angles, angle pairs that are congruent. So that means the angle ACB is congruent to angle DC or ECD. So 17 says, is angle ACB congruent to angle ECD? And that is yes, and the reason that is because they're vertical angles. All right, so then it says CE corresponds to what? So CE would correspond to CA. BC would correspond to DC. And so the question is ACB congruent to angle or triangle EDC? And the answer to that would be yes.